Hello, everyone. Today we're talking about suicide prevention. So before I start, I just wanted to say if you have personally been touched by suicide at some point in your life, then just go easy on yourself when you're watching this content. And if you're feeling vulnerable in any way, just leave it for the moment and come back to it when you're feeling a little bit more able to deal with the content. So just be mindful of that and go slow. Don't force yourself to sit through this lecture if you're feeling like it's too much right now. So today we're talking about suicide prevention, particularly in relation to young people, but I'm also going to be talking in general about suicide prevention with everyone.
I have my ups and downs, like anyone else.
Maybe more than anyone else.
Things can be hard to figure out.
I like my privacy. I like to work things out myself.
I don't like you looking over my shoulder all the time.
But you know your kid better than anyone. And if you think she hasn't been herself lately.
Acting really down, crying all the time for no reason.
Getting really mad.
I'm not able to sleep, sleeping too much.
Shutting his friends out. Staying in his room all the time.
Acting reckless, drinking, using drugs.
Not doing the stuff you used to love.
Doing stuff that's not like her.
Might be nothing to worry about. It might just be high school.
But it might be something more. She might be depressed.
Not just feeling down, really depressed.
Your kid might be thinking about killing himself.
It happens more than you'd think. More than it should.
And when it's too late, people say, I had no idea.
I thought it was just a phase.
I never thought she'd actually do it.
I wish she'd said something.
I wish I'd said something.
If you think your kid's acting differently, if she seems like a different person, you should say something.
Ask, what's wrong? Do you want to talk about it? How can I help?
Maybe you're afraid you'll make it worse if you ask. Like you put the idea in their head.
It doesn't work like that.
The best way to help a teenager who might be suicidal is to just ask. Are you feeling so bad that you're thinking about killing yourself?
If they say yes,
Maybe.
Sometimes.
Don't say,
That's crazy.
Don't be such a drama queen. That boy's not worth killing yourself over.
You're not gonna kill yourself.
you're just trying to get attention.
Yes, they're trying to get attention. They feel distressed, lost, alone.
What you should say is,
I'm sorry you're feeling so bad.
Do you want to talk about what's going on?
How can I help?
we'll get through this together.
Let's keep you safe.
A lot of people feel so bad that they think about killing themselves. Adults and kids.
so if your kid says,
Things are never going to change.
I can't live like this.
I'd be better off dead.
I'm going to kill myself.
Take him seriously. Listen to what he's got going on for him. And find someone you can talk to about it. Someone who knows how to help.
Talk to your doctor.
Talk to a counsellor at your kid's school.
Don't just let it go.
Make sure your kid always has someone to talk to. Someone she trusts.
You could make a list together, 4 or 5 names of people they trust.
Put the number of a mental health support line on there too.
Ask him to keep the list in his wallet or his phone. That way he always knows who he can go to.
Make sure your home is safe straight away.
If you have any medication that she could use to hurt herself, lock it up.
Don't leave him alone.
Take her to the nearest hospital.
Call 000 if you have to.
If you think something might be wrong, the only way to find out is to ask.
Ask straight out. Are you thinking about killing yourself?
It can make a big difference.
It could make all the difference to your kid's life.
Okay, so just wanted to talk about some myths that impact the area of suicide prevention. And the first one is that most people who kill themselves suffer from a mental illness. Think about whether you agree, disagree, or unsure about that. Well, in fact, even though people who are suicidal often report feeling depressed, it doesn't, feeling suicidal doesn't automatically mean that they have a mental illness. Sometimes it's a big change or a loss in their life that can induce suicidal feelings. So it's not necessarily the case that someone always has a mental illness. Another big one, talking with a depressed person about suicide increases their risk of suicide. Now, this is a big fear that a lot of people have, and it's one of the reasons why people don't talk about it more. So there's no evidence to suggest that when we raise the topic of suicide, it's going to make someone more likely to think about doing it. And in fact, the more people are able to talk about their feelings, the more they're likely to be able to experience some relief in distress. So it will only help if someone's feeling that way. But if someone's not feeling that way, talking about it isn't going to put that idea into their heads. A person who talks about suicide or threatens to kill themselves is just after attention and is not likely to do it. So one of the biggest indicators of a suicide attempt is actually indicating that, that someone is going to kill themselves. So we need to always take it seriously. And like the girl in the video said, they are after attention, but it's a cry for for help because they can't see any other options. So we always need to take indications of intent to suicide seriously. So another area that impacts suicide prevention is stigma and talking about suicide and using the right terminology. And you'll notice that that suicide is not reported in the media, and that's to prevent suicide contagion. But there's also things that we can do in our everyday life in terms of how we talk about suicide that can help reduce the stigma of suicide and prevent contagion. So first of all, we often hear the term committed suicide, and that might seem fine. But the issue with the term committed is that it suggests that someone who does not complete suicide, who does not die, is not committed to the action. And so we want to take away this idea that someone who dies from suicide is successful in that. So all of these terms, such as successful suicide, unsuccessful, failed attempt at suicide, we want to take away that idea of, if the suicide leads to someone dying, if the suicide attempt leads to someone dying, then that was a successful suicide. Obviously, it's quite the opposite. It's the worst case scenario. So just to keep that in mind and try and use, a different term such as suicided or died by suicide, or ended his or her life, or attempt to end her or his life is a better way of referring to it. Words can have a big impact on the people around us, and it can help us combat some of the stigma that people face. So what do we know about what leads to suicide? Well, the latest thinking is really around the factors that exist in someone's life in order to lead to that desire for suicide. And the interpersonal theory of suicide is generally accepted as being the most robust way of thinking about suicidality. So the interpersonal theory of suicide, which is on Blackboard as a reading for you, talks about there's three requirements for someone to feel that desire and capability for suicide. The first one is the feeling of being alone. So whether that being rejected by peers, or not having a community, or having problems with family. So feeling like there's no one there for them. They're alone. The second condition is perceived burdensomeness. So the feeling that I am a burden, people would be better off if I wasn't here. And the third one is the capability for suicide. So that's things like access to means to suicide, such as drugs or a gun, for example. Also, the ability to withstand pain, and able to withstand the fear that can come with suicide attempts. And that's the reason why if someone's attempted before, the capability for suicide rises, so it becomes greater, which means the desire for suicide will rise as well. And these three factors are needed to exist in order for suicide attempts to take place. So the suicide risk factors, first of all, a direct verbal warning is one of the most useful predictors of suicide. So you need to take any of those statements seriously. And we can't ever assume that someone is just looking for attention or trying to get out of something. We always need to take it seriously. So people might say, you'll be better off without me, indicating that they see themselves as a burden, that they can't see a way out of their situation. I've had enough, or I'm over it. So they see the problem they're in lasting forever, which suggests that suicide becomes a solution to that perpetual problem. They're feeling a sense of hopelessness, so there's nothing to live for, or there's no point. And hopelessness is one emotion that is a great indicator of suicide, because if there's no hope, then there's not many solutions. Other risk factors include previous suicide attempts, as I've talked about before. Making an attempt before tends to increase people's tolerance to pain and to the fear around the action of suicide. A history of substance abuse. Certainly when people are under the influence of alcohol or drugs, they are more at risk of suicidal behaviour. And that's because that reduces their fear and their avoidance of pain, and it increases their impulsive behaviour. So they're less likely to think through an action before doing it. History of mental health conditions, things like depression, anxiety, bipolar. And so those conditions are not a precursor to suicidal behaviour. However, sometimes when someone hasn't received the right treatment, their experience of those conditions is so uncomfortable and so distressing that they can only see suicide as a solution. So it's not necessarily that depression causes suicide, but it's more the experience of depression that hasn't been addressed sufficiently can cause suicidal thoughts and behaviour. Relationship problems, so conflict with parents or with partners, or a loss of a relationship, or problems with friends, can make people feel like this is I'll never get over this, or this is a problem that's never going to go away. Legal or disciplinary problems, and certainly when people are young, they have less ability to see that a problem they're facing right now, for example, they've been expelled from school, that will get better. So they seem, they have a less ability to look into the future and say, while this feels terrible right now, it will not seem so bad in, the short to medium term. Access to harmful means is another risk factor. So someone who has access to weapons, or someone who has access to drugs. And this is certainly why in certain fields like veterinary science, suicide rates are higher, because there's a higher access to means, combined with many other factors. A recent death of a family member or a close friend, ongoing exposure to bullying behaviour, and again that relates to young people's distress and less ability to see a problem as being resolvable and being short term. So they see it as, my life is over, I'm never going to get past this, my reputation is ruined, all that kind of thing. So they really need help in seeing their way out of a problem. And physical illness or disability is another risk factor for people. So risk factors are factors that place someone obviously more at risk of suicide, but there's also triggers. So someone might have several risk factors, but then there might be a trigger that precipitates their suicidal behaviour. And one of them is certainly relationship breakdowns. With adults, relationship breakup is one of the biggest triggers for suicidal behaviour. Having arguments with family or friends where you're feeling very upset or very misunderstood, very alone, like a burden. A suicide of a family member or friend or peer, and that relates to that contagion factor, the idea that suicide is an option for people, and what sometimes happens is that the person who is dies by suicide is held up as as a hero, and so that can increase that contagion factor. Media report of suicide or social media, again, that creates that contagion factor. Levels of mental distress, so if someone's very depressed, very anxious, or they're moving into a psychosis, which you wouldn't see that often, but certainly between the ages of 16 and 21 is when the disorders such as schizophrenia tend to emerge. and that can create a trigger for suicidal behaviour. Unexpected life change, imprisonment, unemployment, so things that include a great loss to the person and a great adjustment as well to the new circumstances. And being abused or bullied obviously is another trigger. So these are particular risk factors for young people. Mental illness or disorder. So that's untreated depression, for example, can lead to feeling like there's no way out of how they're feeling. Abuse and violence in the home. Family dispute, conflict and dysfunction. So constant fighting in the household or no communication at all in the household. So if you notice a change in a young person, it's often good to ask them, what's going on at home? Is there anything going on at home that's impacting you? A family history of suicide or mental illness can certainly impact as well, for the reasons I've talked about before. Warning signs for young people. So these are changes in moods, so a sense of hopelessness or there's no point, or seeing a young person being very down, losing interest in activities that used to be important to them, such as sport or art or hanging out with their friends, changes in sleeping and eating patterns. So maybe they keep being late to school because they overslept, or they're really tired because they're not sleeping at night, or they're overeating, or they're not eating at all. Problems with relationships, so having a lot of conflicts with peers, for example, or with teachers. Withdrawal as well. Particularly for young people, anger, hostility or irritability that seems out of context, so overboard or seems out of character for that young person, are other risk factors. And another area that that is worth talking about is the LGBTI populations, because there's a increased risk for LGBTI populations when it comes to suicide. And these are the specific risk factors that have been identified for this population, such as, you know, issues with disclosure of sexuality in terms of, you know, being rejected by family, threats of abuse. Conflict is a big one between sexuality and religious beliefs, and often culture or cultural background comes into that as well. So perhaps their sexuality and their cultural background and religious beliefs are clashing, and that's very difficult for people to reconcile. Social isolation, because they feel different from their peers, and they're not quite sure where they fit in the world, and being young, not having that experience of finding, you know, a group of people that they feel comfortable with. An absence of positive role models, possible self-medication to cope with feeling so different and conflicted and unsure, and failure of communities to provide inclusive social activities. So seeing everywhere that you know, that heterosexual couples are the only model for how people can participate in society. Heterosexual relationships are the expected, and so on. So feeling like you can't fit in with the community and participate because of your sexuality. So what helps reduce the risks of suicide? So protective factors are factors that that mediate the risk factors. So the risk factors might be there, but having plenty of protective factors for a young person helps stop those risk factors becoming turning into suicidal thinking or behaviour. So connectedness to family and school, so feeling like you're part of something is a really big one. So being connected with your family or with school activities or with a youth centre, they're all really helpful, or a sports club. Responsibility for children, that obviously relates to adults, and feeling like you're responsible for your family is a protective factor. Presence of significant others, so for young people that can be a central parent, a parent figure or a mentor, a spouse or a partner for older people. Personal resilience and problem-solving skills. And this is something that we can actually help young people develop. And a little bit later in this course, I'll be talking more about this in terms of how we help young people develop resilience. And so these are things, you know, resilience and problem-solving skills are things that you can actually incorporate into your lessons. And help young people see their own strengths and how they can build their own resilience in everyday life. Good physical and mental health. And so helping students to reduce their stress is a really important one as well, so that their mental health isn't impacted. If there are mental health problems, getting the young person support and treatment for those mental health problems. And good physical health, obviously, as well, feeds into mental health. So a good diet, enough sleep, enough exercise are really important factors. So if a young person is participating in sport regularly, that is a really good protective factor. If they live in a stable household where they're getting good nutrition, again, that's a protective factor. Economic security. Now, this is more particularly with older people. A strong faith is a protective factor, whether that's a spiritual faith or a religious faith, or a sense of the meaning in life, or the meaning of problems, or why we might struggle in life. So some sense of why we're here and why or how we can get through problems in life. Community and social integration, so feeling like you're part of your community and your social circle. Early identification and treatment for psychiatric illness. So for a young person who's showing signs of developing a mental health disorder, it's important to get them treatment early on, particularly when we're talking about psychotic illnesses such as schizophrenia. It's really important to be able to pick up that there's been a change in the person and get them a referral for intervention. A belief that suicide is not the answer, that suicide will impact all of the people around them, that they won't be here anymore when they suicide. It's not the answer. A lack of access to violent means is the final one. Things like guns, not having access to guns, not having access to medications, but also not having access to the opportunity, so not being on their own is a big one. So what can we do when we suspect someone is at risk of suicide? Well, raising the issue is the main one, and this is something that people struggle with because they can feel inadequate to deal with the answer to the question of, are you thinking about killing yourself? So they don't ask because they're like, oh, what if they say yes? I don't know what to do. Feeling helpless, so feeling like you won't be able to help them at all. And concerns about, oh, well, if I ask them this now, I've got another class to run in, 10 minutes. So maybe I'll leave it for today because I won't be able to have enough time to deal with it. That could be in your 10 minutes of opportunity there. And it's really important that that someone's life is the priority here. And if you need to, you can get support to run your class or someone to take over from you, but ask the question regardless of what you think is coming up in the next hour or so. And this is the main thing about suicide prevention. If you don't ask, you won't know someone's intentions. And if you don't know, you can't intervene, you can't provide support, you can't show that you care. So you are helpless if you don't ask. So it seems simple to ask about suicide, but it's not, because we've been culturally raised to avoid talking about death. So there's a lot of discomfort and fears about raising the topic of suicide. There's also that fear that it can increase someone's risk of suicide. However, it's really crucial that you do ask, and you need to rehearse this and of how you might actually say this. And we'll do this in the tutorials. And you need to practice so you become more comfortable saying those words. So in the tutorials, we're going to get you to actually say those words. Are you thinking about killing yourself? And don't expect it to be comfortable, but it's really important to actually start saying those words. So these are some questions that you can ask. Have you wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? If the person says no, then ask them, you know, in the past 3 months, have you done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? If the person says yes, they wish they were dead, ask them, have you thought about how you might do this? Because this asking, have you thought about how you might do this, gets to whether they are starting to make a plan, which indicates to you that they're more at risk. If someone's starting to make a plan of how they might and when they might, then the risk is higher. So we need to ascertain whether they've started to work out the means and the method of suicide. And when we find out that someone has decided on the means and the method and when they're going to do it, that's when we need to intervene as a crisis. So we need to respond as if this is an emergency, if someone has a plan. If someone has general thoughts about suicide, but no plan, no method, no means, it's just a more an abstract thought that they're having, then they're still at risk, but it's not an emergency. So we need to still refer and provide that person with support, but that would not be a situation where you would be calling an ambulance or calling the suicide callback line. So if a young person tells you, yes, they are thinking about suicide, yes, they've thought about, you know, how they might do it, you need to make sure that the student isn't left alone, always has an adult with them. So first and foremost, you can say, look, let's, what's really important to me is keeping you safe. And I don't feel okay about you leaving on your own right now. So I'm going to get Mrs. Jones from next door just to sit with you while I go and talk to the, you know, the psychologist or the principal about getting you some support or getting your parents to come and be with you. It's also important that we let students know that because of the risk to themselves, we can't keep the secret. We can't keep suicidal intent or thoughts or behaviour secret. We do need to share that with the appropriate staff members to keep them safe because you care about them. And then the other really important area is not trying to deal with this all on your own. So always get support from somebody else, whether it's your principal, the school psychologist, if they're on school grounds at the time, a more senior teacher. Get someone involved. You shouldn't be dealing with this on your own. It's too much for one person to think through, and it's a stressful situation. So always get someone else involved. And once the crisis has been managed, so the young person has been referred, or their parent has come to pick them up and is taking them to the hospital to get assessed, or to a psychologist appointment, to the GP. So the crisis has been has passed. You will feel that adrenaline going through your body, because that's a stressful situation. So make sure that you talk with a colleague about what's happened, how you felt, what you were worried about, all those kinds of things. So it's really important to process all of that afterwards, and then do something like go for a walk to get rid of some of that adrenaline that you're feeling. Because when we don't do that, and these kinds of situations stress us out on a regular basis, that's when stress can take an impact on you. And more serious stress disorders can occur. And I'll talk more about that when we talk about burnout. So the key actions I've just talked about are outlined in this link here, suicide prevention. And then if you're interested in learning more about suicide prevention, you can do the mental health first aid course. Or there are gatekeeper training courses that are really good. And a gatekeeper is someone who's trained to intervene, or to recognise and support people who are at risk of suicide. Safety planning has been used for a long time when we're talking about risk of harm, and it's quite useful. What a safety plan is helping someone develop, first of all, an understanding of the first signs of that they're becoming distressed, and then a plan of how they can help reduce that distress for themselves. So maybe it's take a bath, or maybe it's go for a walk, or call a friend, or listen to some music. And then if that doesn't help, who they can seek help from in those moments. So having a list of people that they can call to talk to, or to get help. And then in a crisis, what can they do if they're actively feeling suicidal? So that would be more the emergency numbers and so on. So a safety plan is a really useful tool. It should be developed by a mental health professional, so possibly the school psychologist, but teachers can use the safety plan to prompt the young person to remember to use that safety plan. And you can have a look at an example at this link. And these are some of the most important telephone numbers. Suicide callback service is a 1300 number that if you call and you don't have any credit on your phone, they will call back. So not having any credit is not an issue in terms of getting help. So if you're with a young person or anybody, in fact, who you feel is at risk of suicide, you can say, can I call the suicide callback service for you to get them immediate assistance. Lifeline, Samaritans and the Kids Helpline are also available. If someone is at immediate risk, the Mental Health Emergency Response Line, or MERL as we call it, is another 1300 number, and they can actually come out to where you are to assist and to keep that person safe. So it's similar to an ambulance service. And so it's a good idea to print off these numbers and just have them somewhere, you know, in your top drawer or whatever at school, so you've got them at the ready should something arise. And so when we're thinking about doing a suicide assessment, for a long time in the area we've had checklists and 20 questions about suicide intent or risk factors and so on. But the most important thing is, first of all, we ask the question about whether someone's thinking about killing themselves, but also finding out what's going on in that person's life, showing interest, showing that you care, having a discussion, and all those skills that you've been learning in counselling so far are all going to enable you to have that discussion and have make an effective assessment of someone's risk. Much more so than having a checklist of boxes that you need to tick off. All right, so that's the lecture for today. And in the tutorial, we're going to be doing a few activities to understand risk factors, practicing saying the words around suicide, and doing a final practice session before we start our assessments the following week.